Good morning, everyone. I'm here with Mark Feifel today, who is the founder and the CEO of Off the Record Strategies. He's also the former assistant to President George W. Bush and former director of communications for the Republican National Convention. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Jan.
It's really good to have you again. It's a pleasure.
Every day.
Almost every
Thursday,
day.
Friday, and now Monday. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much again. We really appreciate having you here, and thank you for making time. So we're gonna have a few topics to discuss within this 30 minutes. I would like to talk to you about Ukraine, United States, China, but let me start off with
nothing easy.
No.
Nothing. No softballs today. Okay.
Will be more difficult than the Situation Room. But let me start with Saudi Arabia. OPEC announced the biggest cut to oil production since the start of the pandemic. The oil production should be cut by 2 million barrels per day. And my question for you is this from the perspective of Biden's administration foreign policy, is this a failure?
A failure is such a tough word. I would say it's a very difficult challenge for the United States. We are and have been historically pretty energy independent and moving towards that direction with more oil and natural gas production done domestically. But during the Biden administration, they made the strategic decision to halt or limit or cut back on fossil fuels. And I think for good intentions. They look at climate change as an enormous problem. They want to bring about a new generation of renewable energies. But I think that the timeline for getting that done is great, but then you run into something like Russia and the challenges from an energy standpoint that have happened across the world. Now you add inflation to that, and then there's an enormous challenge. And I think that, yes, that the Saudis did look and say, in their perspective, they were treated wrongly. In the Biden administration perspective and in their political calculations, and I think in their human rights calculations, they said that what Saudi Arabia did and their human rights record, especially with the just horrific slaughter of a Saudi national and journalist, writer for the Washington Post, that they were going to deter or try and change the behavior of Saudi Arabia by separating somewhat in the relationship. Whereas the U.S. and Saudi Arabia historically have had a very active bilateral relationship, Biden decided to take a step back from that. And I think the Saudis said, okay, we'll see you. Yeah, that's good. And we're going to hurt you we're going to give it to you where it hurts, which is we're going to cut production. I don't think that wins the Saudis any friends across the world. In some ways, they feel that they don't have to have that. What they can do is use their oil as a hammer when needed. And I think that's what they're doing.
It's not too long ago when Joe Biden visited Saudi Arabia and sort of tried to reapproach Saudis after he called them the pariah. And one of his main targets of that visit was actually trying to increase the oil production. So now do you think, because this comes right before the midterm elections in the US, do you think this will hurt Biden and the Democrats?
I think it kind of plays into the overall challenge of energy. You see some specific senatorial races probably that might have a bit of a hurt on the Democratic candidate because oil and gas prices have been so high over the past year or so. Overall, I don't think it's going to have a huge significance on the election. I think that historically, the party in power always has a difficult off-year election, congressional election. I don't think that's going to be any different. It certainly doesn't help.
Yeah. The last question regarding Saudis. Is this a step that brings them closer together with Russia?
Unfortunately, I think that's kind of now you've got to pick a team, and that makes sense because Russia was so horrific in their activities and their wanton slaughter of people in Ukraine that you have to make a choice whether you're China or you're Saudi Arabia or you're Algeria, whoever you are. Whose side are you on? The side of peace and democracy, or an evil dictator that's gone crazy? And so I think that does. But in some ways, the Saudis are so upset with the current administration in Washington that they're okay with that to a point of saying, okay, we're going to cut our production by 2 million barrels and let that go for a bit and just extract some pain, some misery out of the current administration in Washington. And they're okay with that, I think, and which is too bad because who hurts are the consumers across the world that are going to have to pay more money at the gas tank and for their heating oil and other things.
So when you look at Biden's foreign policy or Biden administration's foreign policy more generally, when you look at not just Saudi Arabia, but also JCPOA, the Iran deal, Iran nuclear deal, China, transatlantic relations, how do you see them so far? Has the Biden administration been effective in pursuing its foreign policy so far?
I would say it's been incomplete. I think that they haven't been able to get a renewed deal with Iran. In some ways, Iran is overplaying its hand. It thinks that Biden is right now not in a good negotiating position. On China, remains to be seen as well. What is our strategic relationship with China? I think that they still have an enormous economic impact on the U.S. that is not going to change anytime soon, and they are the number one strategic adversary of the United States. The Afghan withdrawal, devastating. That into itself, from a management situation, is something that was very poorly done. There's still refugees that are stuck in places like UAE, in sort of a purgatory of sorts because of the mismanagement of the administration and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Not that we should have done it eventually, but it should have been done in a smarter way. Now you add, where I think Mr. Biden deserves credit, is the way that he has put together a international coalition to help Ukraine. I think without President Biden's leadership and time and commitment of him and the Secretary of State and Defense and the intelligence community, those leaders working very closely with Ukraine and with NATO, that we wouldn't have Russia in such a difficult situation right now, where this once enormous army is seeing enormous casualties and having a tremendously difficult time moving across this nation, which is much smaller, with less of an armed forces, with less armaments. And so overall, to be determined, I think that no matter who, as somebody who has been in a White House, who's been in that, like you said, in that situation room, there's so many plates that you're spinning every day. And you've got the domestic side and you've got the foreign policy side. You're trying to put your best people in charge in positions so that they can make a difference. You're trying to give the right amount of time in personal relationships with foreign leaders, commitment to international organizations, and a commitment with funds to those organizations. And at the same time, you're dealing with, from the Biden administration, with the ramifications of COVID on the economy. You have the challenges with the economy, and you have some enormous domestic spending legislation that was passed. So all in all, very difficult hand that Mr. Biden was given, and he's doing with it what he can. But I think that it's difficult, especially if you're overseas, to comment very specifically on an American president. Some successes and some enormous challenges.
Quick detour to the Czech Republic. I think what concerns us here, among other issues, is the delay in the appointment of U.S. ambassador to Prague. And it's, as I already said, we are approaching midterms. So it's been yes.
Are you listening, United States Senate nomination process?
Sure, they are.
Help this man out. Yeah. Help this country out.
So can you help us understand what's behind such delay in appointing U.S. ambassadors? And I know it's not just the problem of the Czech Republic, right? It's more. It was until recently, I believe, NATO and other countries without ambassador.
Yeah, it's very much needed is to prioritize that. So the government 101 is that sometimes it takes a while for an administration to nominate the ambassadors. Sometimes they're career foreign service officers. Sometimes they're political appointees. It just depends on the mission. Then they have got to be vetted. So you've got to go through, you've got to look at their finances, every public statement they've ever given. Can they get 51 votes or 50, and the vice president confirming is the 51st vote to break the tie in a Senate that is deadlocked. It is as tight as can be between Democrats and Republicans. And then what happens is a lot of these ambassadors, they get stuck in this in-between area. It's not their fault. It's the Senate schedule, because they have other priorities than confirming ambassadors. And then it gets stuck into a system where a senator might put a hold on every nomination for some time because they want something very minute for their district or for their state. So that's what's going on right now. It's very unfortunate because, especially with the dramatic and really huge challenges that our world has right now, you would hope that the Senate and that the Biden administration would give quality ambassadors and other foreign policy executives, get them out immediately, and that the Senate would move them through to a fair hearing and get them out the door. That would be the ideal thing. American politics does not always want to play on that perfect scenario.
I think my last question about the US and the upcoming elections would be, what are your expectations, and what will be the main topics of the upcoming US elections? So I think overall it's the economy. It's the number one issue for a lot of these elections that are going on. A good deal of the United States Senate, which is every 6 years they are elected. So you've got about a third of the United States Senate. You've got gubernatorial races of state governors, state houses, and then you have 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, and you've got local elections, state and local elections. Mostly, people are going to vote with their wallets and their pocketbooks. Are they better off now than they were 2 years ago? And I think for a lot of Americans, it's still an open question, because 2 years ago we were in a horrific COVID situation. We have seen the vaccines and a lot of the pandemic has subsided, but what we're left with is a lot of higher prices in everything, whether it's food, it's travel, it's just the existence of life, and that is having a dramatic impact. I think there's kind of an uneasiness with that. And I think there's kind of the difficulty that Americans are having right now with, they're kind of in this in-between stage. They didn't really vote for President Biden, many of them. They voted against Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So they're still trying to figure out, do we put a check and a balance in our politics right now, meaning it looks like the House of Representatives will likely go to the Republican Party and give kind of that check to the Biden agenda. But then what comes about that is a whole lot of investigations and a whole lot more kind of turmoil and a whole lot less movement, because things have got to pass in the House. And Mr. Biden at that point might have to be a bit more bipartisan than he is right now.
in a world that doesn't really want to be bipartisan, in a country that is so polarized between the right and the left. One hopes that the leaders in Washington will be able to come together in some forum and help the people of the country. So probably the House, if the election were today, the House would likely go to the Republicans, but not with an overwhelming majority. The Senate would remain extraordinarily close. You'll see some elections, Jan, where crime has risen in a lot of these in some of these states. So you'll also see pocketbook issues and then a safety issue in some of these. A lot of people along the southern border and beyond are unhappy with the immigration policies that are, or lack thereof right now. They might take that out on Mr. Biden as well and on the Democrats.
You didn't mention abortion. Is that a topic as well for the election?
I think the Supreme Court decision also can have some impact. Yeah, I think it will drive out more women voters potentially, but it probably cuts a bit both ways, and the evangelical and religious voters will probably also be more likely to go out as well. But I think it does put that, it's more of a presidential question for the next president in 2 more years, is as the Supreme Court ages, and right now it is a conservative majority, do we want at the front in the White House a Democrat who will probably vote, who will nominate a liberal justice, or a Republican who will bring about more of a conservative justice? And I think that'll play out more in 2024.
Let's talk about Ukraine and then China a little bit.
Like I said, no easy ones.
Yeah.
No easy ones. No softballs today.
Right. Do you think there is still, or do you think there has ever been a chance for political solution to the conflict, to the war?
You know, I've thought so, and I've advocated for it. Like in the conference that we just did, I had mentioned that at some point we've got to bring this to a close. We just have to. I just can't see a situation where this continues for years. Weeks, possibly months, maybe, but not for years. I just don't think there's the will of the international community to continue. I don't think there's the will in Russia, with somewhere between 30 and 50,000 casualties, just an enormous amount of death on both sides right now. I mean, the amount of civilians in Ukraine and military, and the amount of military that are dying of from the Russian military is incalculable from that region. And the challenges that will have to that society in those two countries for generations is enormous. So, and when I've mentioned that, a lot of the people that are so, and for good reason, they are completely invested in Ukraine, and Ukraine should make the decision of when they want to come to an agreement. And where I got into some trouble last week at the conference that your great institution hosted was, oh no, you have to let the Ukrainians figure that out. I'm like, well, usually what happens in many of these situations, whether it's World War II or it's Yugoslavia or whatever it is some elements of the international community have to step up. Number one, both sides have to say, we need to come to a solution on this. And then you need some form of an international coalition or leaders of some type that will help out. The end of the Cold War is another example. If it wasn't for Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev and Pope John Paul, and Ronald Reagan, that kind of brought that about. But it took everybody saying, okay, what we're doing right now is not working. And I'm going to have to give something if I'm in Ukraine. I'm going to have to give something if I'm Russia. The challenge is I don't know if Vladimir Putin is a thinking, logical human being at this point. I think that's where the challenge comes about. But I think that was the same way with World War II at the same time. As you're dealing with a maniacal force. And at one point, we did come about with peace. So I think that's a challenge that has to happen. Now, when we bring up specific solutions, then it becomes very difficult, and then the discussions turn, heated. So Russia took over a part of Crimea in 2014-15 that they've held on to some degree. I don't think they should have done that. I think it's Ukrainian territory. I think Russia has also taken some other areas within Ukraine. So one possible way is, since Crimea is a portion of that, potentially in some type of an agreement, possibly could go to where Russia would keep that small area. Vladimir Putin's able to save face and say, yes, I had this military incursion of sorts, or whatever he calls it, something else. He calls it a military activity. I had this military activity. Yes, we had some casualties, enormous casualties, but now I can take this back and save face. Zelensky can say, we ridded the Russians out. We have the vast majority, the huge majority of our land back, and we drove the Russians out and head back out of town. So I think that's one possibility. Then you bring about the blackmail of sorts that Putin is doing by kind of floating the idea of using a tactical nuclear weapon. So you put all this together in the mix, and you say that there are some elements, whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's a band of international leaders, that would go to both sides at some point when the time is right and say, okay, let's end this thing. Let's come together. It's going to happen in the weeks and months ahead.
So in other words, you think some kind of political solution that Crimea would be Russian, and then the rest outside of Crimea, including these 4 newly annexed regions,
would stay with Ukraine.
Would be Ukraine.
Yeah, just one situation. Yeah, just throwing that out there as a starting point.
So how about Donbass, the two like part of 2 regions that where the separatists took over since 2014? Do you think part of these 2 regions would also at the end be Ukrainian, or they would sort of, the city of Donetsk, for example?
In my heart, it would stay Ukrainian, as I think that's an important thing. I think that Ukrainian population, I think that the way that they've fought so valiantly, I think there's a lot of people that thought that when Russia first attacked Ukraine in February, that we'd still be here talking about this, and the fact that Russia is to some degree on the run. That's amazing. But one of the reasons is because of the amazing will of Ukrainian people and their heart and the soul that they're putting into this. It's also the American and the NATO military. U.S. right now is utilizing military technologies and trying out a lot of things on the battlefield that they haven't had the opportunity to try out really since the invasion of Iraq. And so they are getting to in places like China, which I think is where we're going next, are looking at these weapons and going, okay, maybe we don't want to go after Taiwan or go after new areas in the China Sea. And so it gives the U.S. the opportunity to kind of show its muscle a little bit internationally. But I don't know how long that can continue. Is this, as they say in kind of the foreign policy of the world, is this the West fighting this proxy war against one of its enemies with Ukraine in the middle? And how long will they do that? Historically, sometimes a very long time. Afghanistan, for example, 20 years. The U.S., the Russians in Afghanistan, many years as well. Vietnam, a decade and a half, but it takes a while. I just don't see in current society of it going on that long.
Yeah, right. So in the last couple of minutes, let's go to China.
Okay, around the world.
Easy issue, yeah. It's a very quick journey around the world, but yeah.
Is everybody still with us? Hi.
I'm sure they are. So China. So do you think what's happening with the Western support to Ukraine? Do you think it has is delaying essentially China in invading Taiwan, or or do you think the invasion of Taiwan, or any, let's not call it invasion, but any sort of attack by the mainland China to Taiwan is still a matter of time?
Well, Jan, I think that if I am the Chinese senior leaders and I'm looking at what's going on in Ukraine, it is giving me pause. That it would be a cakewalk of sorts, that we could just go in. And I think also the leadership of Nancy Pelosi, the United States Speaker of the House, going to Taiwan and with a lot of foreign policy wags saying, don't go, you're just gonna turn it into more of a difficult issue. And she said, no, thank you, I'm going. And I think that she showed enormous leadership in doing that. And so I think that there's some activities that have happened where the U.S. has essentially given every indication to China that don't go there. You know, that not that they're going to put boots on the ground of the United States military, but that there will be ramifications from doing that are diplomatic, potentially some military activities, and it's giving them pause. But at the same point, as they just had the big Communist Party meeting this past weekend, and Xi did bring it up, say we're still going to go if we need to. So they're still keeping the option there, but it's not as heated of a rhetoric as it might have been in the past. I think what he's trying to do is kind of put in cement his authorities right now, and which have unprecedented authorities and length of service and continuation. He needs to get that. He needs to get his own house in order before he can really do something that enormous.
Right. So you mentioned Nancy Pelosi and her visit to Taiwan. At the same time, the administration, the White House, sort of said, you know, that's her own thing. That's not our official position. Do you think was it a mistake, or was it some sort of tactics how to play the visit and still stay okay with China?
I think it's one of those that the United States government decided it needed to send a message. It didn't necessarily want to send Mr. Blinken, the Secretary of State, over there. They can't likely send President Biden or Vice President Harris there. So who's third in command in a way? It's the leader of the House. And then I think that then the U.S., some elements of the U.S. government says, oh no, don't go. Well, it's kind of like, just go, send a message. Right, that's part of it. And I think there's been some bipartisan trips as well from the Senate. And in some ways, the only thing that I would like to do differently is I would have liked to have had a bipartisan trip of the United States House. Both parties, committee chairman from Armed Services and Foreign Relations. And I think that would have sent even a stronger message. But I'm still glad that Speaker Pelosi did go and make that point.
Okay. The last time we met in DC, and we had the group which I was part of, we had several meetings, and we discussed U.S. foreign policy. At that time, in the spring, the main focus of U.S. foreign policy was still China, clearly, although the war in Ukraine was already ongoing. Now in October, is it still the same? Is still countering China and Chinese expansionism still the main focus, the main priority of the U.S., or has it?
So I think there's what takes up most of your day. If you're a foreign policy person, like when I was in the White House, 60% of my day was Iraq, because we were involved in this horrific situation, a near civil war or a civil war in a difficult part of the world in the Middle East. 20% of my day was Afghanistan. So we still had tens of thousands of U.S. personnel in that war year 5 to 7, and about 20% on everything else. So your day-to-day, what takes up your time. So I think right now at the White House, it's more of a 50% of your time is Ukraine. So you're having continual meetings and discussions with Vladimir Zelensky and his team, and all of your foreign policy apparatus is working in some way or the other on helping and assisting Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Now, there's other things that are going on at the same time. The biggest strategic adversary of the United States still is China, which means that we have to keep our intelligence community, our diplomatic community, our military on standby, because that is the biggest challenge that's out there long term. And then also you've got to keep Iran, North Korea, and then the big thing is the global economy. So all in all, what happened, what your day is, if you look at the president's schedule, you look at the National Security Advisor's schedule, and what we would do every morning when I worked at the National Security Council is we would have a 6:30 meeting, a.m. So you have to read the papers and get your intelligence report and everything before you go into that 6:30 meeting. Thank goodness I don't have that anymore. Then we would meet in the National Security Advisor's office in the West Wing with the White House press secretary and a couple of other assistants and deputy assistants to the president. And we'd go through the president's day. Just what is it that we got to deal with right now? I'd love to think that we're talking big thoughts and, having long ideological and philosophical discussions about foreign policy complexities. But a lot of it was just, how do we survive this day? How do we get out of here before midnight? And from that standpoint, the number one challenge that they're dealing with is just how do we help Ukraine? How do we get Russia off of its center and maybe push them off?
So I guess my very last question is, do you miss these times? Do you like to be back in the situation room and making these, decisions and advices? I
remember, I'm probably going to tell a bit too much, but I remember being outside before I'd have that 6:30 meeting, and I was drinking, so Red Bull would have one of these gigantic sugar-free Red Bulls, and I don't mean like the 11 ounce, but what's like the biggest one, like a 30 ounce or some bizarre size. I don't think we
even sell them here in
It's
Europe.
an energy drink that I think that if you have two of them, your heart stops, okay? So in one hand, I've got this Red Bull. Now I've just got a cup of wonderful coffee that Roman made for me. Now I've got this gigantic Red Bull in one hand, and I have a Marlboro Ultralight in the other hand. I'm doing this, and I'm doing this. And I just thought, you know what? This and this is not going to go well. So I don't miss the stress. I would have a full head of hair if I hadn't have done all of that. I'm probably due for an angioplasty at some point because of the stress from it. But it's an enormous amount of fun and an enormous opportunity. So I would say to young people or middle-aged people, get involved in foreign policy as a profession, as a career. If you're not already, see if you can join your government in some way, with its foreign affairs or with its foreign ministry or wherever you're listening to this. There's nothing more important that you'll look at from a career standpoint outside of family and your personal life. But from a professional standpoint, you will look back on, and I look back on my time working in government as an enormous opportunity and a way that you can really help your fellow citizens.
Perfect. Mark Feifel, the former assistant to President George W. Bush, was our guest today. So Mark, thank you so much again for making time and coming here to our office. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all for now from the Institute. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you a good day. Thank you.